third keynote speaker of the day is Dr. Kevin Pixley. Kevin Pixley has a bachelor's degree in agronomy from Purdue University, a master's of science in crop physiology from the University of Florida, and a PhD in plant breeding from Iowa State University. Dr. Pixley spent his years at CIMMYT at the Harare, Zimbabwe research station, where he served as team leader there as of 1997. After 11 years in Africa, he returned to the CIMMYT headquarters in Mexico to serve in direct positions in the Global Maize Program. He is currently director of CIMMYT Genetic Resources Program and leads the Seeds of Discovery project, which is developing an open access platform of genomic and phenotypic databases along with informatic tools to facilitate the use of maize and wheat biodiversity in applied research and breeding programs. His accomplishments include the development of disease-resistant and nutritionally enhanced maize variety. The title of his presentation today is Healthier Food for a Healthier or More Equitable, Wealthier World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Pixley today.
All right, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I really would like to thank the organizing committee of students who gave me this opportunity, as well as DuPont Pioneer for organizing and allowing this sort of event to go on. I would invite anyone to jot down my email. I'd love to hear from some of you afterwards if you have follow-up interests or questions to discuss. So I was asked to talk about healthier food for a healthier world, and of course I decided to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about anyway, but I will very much relate it to this topic. I think of agriculture as really serving nutrition, health, and poverty alleviation. And what I'm going to go through is pretty much three sections to my presentation. First, I'll give you a background of how I see these themes relating to each other: agriculture, nutrition, health, and poverty alleviation. Then I'll give you some examples of CIMMYT, the organization where I work, a couple of projects that we're working on that address these topics. And then I'll be a little bit more specific about a project on breeding for nutritional enhancement, which perhaps is what you had more in mind when you invited me to give this presentation. So I'd like to start with this a little bit dated paper, which illustrates the key fact about nutrition and health. Here we see over the several decades what happened to the height, that is the height of adult males and females, both in the United States and in Brazil. And what you can see is actually, of course, a growing average height of adults in these two countries over decades. Then what's a little bit less intuitive is that you can see here a relationship between the height of both males and females in both the United States and in Brazil, and the years of education that they achieved during their lives. And again, it's a little bit surprising. You see, taller people have more years of education, both in the, of course, these are a few decades ago, but this relationship pretty much holds true, particularly in Brazil. And what becomes even less intuitive, at least to me, is the relationship holds between height achieved by adults and their wages earned, or their income, which I think of as wealth. So there's a relationship here between the height achieved, the educational level achieved, and the likely income that they're going to achieve in life. And it's kind of a perplexing thing, at least it was to me in the beginning. Now in nutrition, we or they often use stunting or height of children as an indicator of nutritional status, as an indicator of mental development, as an indicator even of future achievements that they're likely to be able to enhance or to achieve, in fact, including educational achievements. And so there's a powerful association between these things, between the nutrition that you achieve and the height that you achieve and the income that you're able to achieve. And what's even more surprising to me is that you have about 3 generations required in order to overcome severe malnutrition in a family background. So it can take even from your grandparents to your parents to you before you can actually overcome problems, nutritional problems that would have resulted in stunting in us humans. So this explains somewhat what's going on in these data. Now the other part of the story I trace back to when I first went to teach at Madison, Wisconsin in 2009. I visited the local grocery store, the Kopp's grocery store, to do some little bit of a evaluation of what it costs to feed yourself, at least in the United States. And so this is the food pyramid that was used at the time before they introduced MyPlate, which is now the preferred one. But I still use the pyramid because here we can see, at least at Kopp's restaurant, at Kopp's grocery store, to get one serving of meat or fish, it would cost you about 71 cents. This was in 2010 or 11. To get one serving of dairy products, it would be about 60 cents. To get one serving of fruits and vegetables, 25 to 40 cents. And of course, if you were a starving student, you would go for the pasta or the rice or the potato because it's going to cost you about 15 cents per serving, and you're probably going to be a lot more satisfied with a half cup of rice than with a half cup of broccoli in terms of filling your stomach. So this has real implications about what I'm going to be talking about, the relationship between wealth and your access to an adequate nutrition, and therefore your health, and therefore your ability also to generate income for yourself. So indeed it is a triangle, a system where we can see that your nutritional intake is largely influenced by your wealth. Your nutritional intake influences your health, your ability to perform well at school, your ability to perform well at work, to not have absenteeism problems at work, which influences your income generating capacity. And I think of this very much as a self-reinforcing cycle. And for those of us who work in the area of agriculture or health or nutrition, this can be both a positive or it can be a negative cycle. So I like to think of it as positive because these are areas of intervention where we can all make a difference and it will build on itself. So if you can improve nutritional intake, you will improve health and you will improve wealth, income, and it will have a reinforcing positive effect. So this is largely what we're going to be talking about today, and what I think of when you ask me healthier foods for healthier lives, I really think about these things being intricately interwoven and inseparable. And it helps us to understand this dilemma perhaps that I presented in the earlier slides, and really now, to me at least, it makes complete sense. So what's happening around the world in terms of wealth and health? Here we see the Millennium Development Goals were for 2015, so we've just come to the end, the conclusion of the Millennium Development Goals. And one of them was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And we see a snapshot here. The countries in green are countries that were achieving or set to achieve the Millennium Development Goal. Those in yellow were making progress, but they weren't going to achieve the intended target. And those in red were not even making progress. Now, if we look at under 5 mortality, it looks very similar. If you remember the previous map, we can go back. Areas in yellow and red are those areas that were not going to achieve the target for reducing under 5 mortality. And keep in mind that undernutrition is an underlying cause of about half of under 5 deaths. I love these maps, and so if you haven't found this website, and you might want to jot it down, you can find these maps for lots of traits that could be of interest to you. And this shows wealth prevalence around the world. And you can see Japan, you can see the United States, overly prominent on this map, illustrating the status in terms of wealth in these countries. And you really can't even see Africa on this map. If you remember, where were the problems of under 5 mortality and underweight prevalence? They correlate very well to these areas that we can't see on the wealth map. If we switch it around and say, okay, where is the most under 5 mortality? Well, suddenly there's Africa right in your face, and India and South Asia as well. So the relationship between wealth, nutrition, and health, I hope, is now very much ingrained in your minds as we move forward to what we can do about it. And if you're looking for a hero in life, I like to propose, among others, Nelson Mandela. And he indicated that poverty is not an accident. And we can eradicate poverty if we choose to do so. And so I think one question that I challenge the students who invited me to this symposium is to think about whether poverty is something that you would like to eradicate. You might first think if it exists in the U.S., but I'm sure you'll quickly arrive at the conclusion that it does. And then can we and how do we go about eradicating it? So this is largely what CIMMYT is about, the organization where I work. And so CIMMYT is the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. Our mission is to sustainably increase productivity, so yields, but also to look at food security and also poverty alleviation because of this relationship that exists among these items. CIMMYT has offices in 22 countries worldwide. I live in Mexico, and this looks like it's close to the beach, but it's really not. We're right in the center of Mexico. And we have over 220 internationally recruited scientists, and we'd invite certainly students from Texas A&M to join us. We have currently scientists from more than 50 nations, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our genetic resources, where we hold more than 28,000 maize and about 140,000 wheat accessions in the Genebanks at CIMMYT. Sort of our influence, or where does CIMMYT work? And this is just a one-year snapshot. It's 2012. In blue, you see places which represent recipients of wheat seed shipments from CIMMYT during that year, and in red, recipients of maize seed shipments during that year. So this is basically our sphere of influence in terms of germplasm in any given year. What about some examples of what we've achieved, or some of our impact examples? This in the bar graph is a recent example of an impact assessment from our wheat breeding, in this case spring wheat breeding. You can see particularly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, the two with the tallest red bars. The red bar are varieties that are direct CGIAR, and CGIAR is the group of sister institutions that includes CIMMYT. And there's only two of us that work on wheat, so this would be CIMMYT and ICARDA, released varieties. And so you see in some of these countries of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, about 50% of the cultivated wheat varieties come directly from CIMMYT materials or ICARDA materials. Another 20 or 25%, reaching total of 75%, includes a parent from our material. So tremendous impact of CIMMYT germplasm in the wheat consumption, particularly of those poor countries that you saw so huge on the poverty maps and on the malnutrition maps. About 50% also of maize in the developing world contains germplasm originating from CIMMYT, and we've trained well over 10,000 scientists through our various activities, including co-supervision of graduate students. I don't think Norman Borlaug needs any introduction at Texas A&M University, but he made some really interesting statements around the time that he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1970. And one of them that he made in 1969 was the seriousness or magnitude of the world food problem should not be underestimated. And this was now when the Green Revolution was showing its impacts. It says, recent success in expanding wheat, rice, and maize production in Asian countries, basically it's buying us 20 to 30 years. And so 40 years later, we have the Prime Minister of India on Independence Day saying that they want a safety net, so no citizen in their country suffers from hunger. He says that they need to increase productivity. The only way to achieve this is through increasing productivity. And strikingly, he says there's been no major technological breakthrough in agriculture since the Green Revolution. He talks about a few things that we'll mention a bit further, but I found intriguing, and I don't know how many of you are aware, there are 23 countries in the world that guarantee in their constitution the right to food. And there's about another 25 or 6 that don't actually say it in so many words, but pretty much indicate that, yes, citizens of their countries have the right to food. And I can tell you the United States is not one of those. So that might be something that we would like to consider, whether we believe that everyone in this country, and indeed in the world, has the right to have food. What happens when you don't have enough food? Well, this chart illustrates the food price index over several years, and the red lines indicate events of social unrest, and numbers of deaths that occurred from those are shown in parentheses. And some of these, for example, in Syria, are still ongoing, but they started during the Arab Spring that resulted or started with increased wheat prices in particular in parts of North Africa. So there's a huge correlation, very strong correlation between food prices, access to food, and social unrest that I think is of concern and has to be of concern to all of us. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the two examples of projects that we're conducting at CIMMYT to help us address these types of issues. We're looking at a series of converging challenges now to agricultural productivity. I don't think any of this is new to this audience, so I won't dwell on it. But of course, the impacts of climate change are of great concern. India has tremendous problems with depletion of underground water resources, particularly in their breadbasket in the Punjab areas, and concerns about conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And I find this quote from Megan Clark, former CEO of the Australian organization CSIRO, saying in the next 50 years we're going to have to produce as much food as has been consumed in the whole history of mankind. And if you're a plant breeder, you start to get a little bit nervous when you read statements like this under such challenges. So one of the two projects that I'll describe briefly is Seeds of Discovery. It's a project that I'm directly involved in, overseeing, and it's thinking about how we can more intelligently, more efficiently utilize genetic resources that exist in gene banks, such as CIMMYT's gene bank, to enhance plant breeding to address many of these challenges that you saw on the previous slide. So this is a snapshot of our gene bank where we have these 28,000 different maize collections at CIMMYT. And I like to think of it as a library. You know, each one of these containers is like a book on the shelves of the library. Except that what's kind of interesting or mind-boggling is that it's all the same book. It's all the book of maize. You know, there's 28,000 of them. It's basically maize, right? Except that what makes the difference between each one of those 28,000 are the details. The details, of course, in the DNA and in the environmental interactions with the expression of the genes encoded by that DNA and even some of the non-coded factors that influence the expression of genes. And a lot of this can actually be seen at the DNA level. So one of the things we're doing is we're sequencing using genotype by sequencing. We've already sequenced basically all the materials for maize. We've done about 50,000 of the wheat accessions as well as 20,000 wheat wild relatives from the Acarta gene bank. And so as somebody pointed out earlier today, that's not much use without phenotypic data. So we're also investing in phenotyping for some key traits because obviously, you know, the number of traits you could phenotype is nearly infinite. But we've looked at particularly heat tolerance and drought tolerance, a few nutritional traits as well. And for example, we've had what Matthew Reynolds, our wheat physiologist, believes is probably the largest wheat trial ever, with 70,000 wheat gene bank accessions evaluated for heat tolerance. And we've been able to make some associations to see which genomic regions are most associated with conveying or conferring heat tolerance. So we think of our gene bank as a supermarket. But the supermarket looks a bit like this picture here. You go in there and all you know about this is it was collected at 1,000 meters above sea level and it was, 15 degrees north latitude. And you might be able to then look up the average temperatures, and that's about all you know about these materials until we start putting some genotypic and some phenotypic information together with that, and hopefully that's going to assist breeders, and we're already finding it being quite useful in identifying materials that could provide sources of resistance, for example, to maize lethal necrosis, a new disease of maize that's causing tremendous losses and concerns in Eastern Africa. The second example I'm going to tell you about what we do at CIMMYT relates to our clients. And this is actually a pretty good-looking maize field in Zambia, probably getting above average yields. But you can immediately see that this isn't going to be a yield breaker, at least it wouldn't be in this part of the world, which looks more like this. So average yield of 9 or 10 tons per hectare in the United States, average yield of 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare in most African countries where I've had the privilege of working. So how do we go about addressing these types of contrasting target environments? Well, we set up trials like this one, where we deliberately implement stress. And last night at dinner time, one of the students asked me, well, how do you manage to make progress in these types of environments, where obviously heritability is much lower than in a well-managed, high-input, high-yielding environment? And our strategy is to develop very uniformly treated plots like these that you see here so that we can actually well mimic the reality of the farmer, but also increase heritability as far as can be possible for these types of environments. Here's another farmer, this one in Zimbabwe, and I bring it there because the color scheme looks almost the same as our low nitrogen fields in this illustration. And one important point is we are not interested in sacrificing yield potential. We don't want a farmer who suddenly does invest in putting fertilizer to get no return from that. So we always use a selection index to combine these two things. This is what it looks like perhaps visually, but what I really want to spend more time on is on this graph, and it's a little bit difficult without a pointer, but I'll walk you through it. This is a summary plot showing the results of a large number of yield trials. And so the number at the bottom, trial number 18, means there were 18 trials in this overall experiment, where the average yield of those 18 trials was between 0 and 1 tons per hectare. There were 41 locations or trials where the average yield was between 1 and 2 tons per hectare. So between those two columns, we get pretty much the average yields in most of sub-Saharan Africa where we work. And there were 7 trials that actually achieved more than 9 tons per hectare on average. And then we compared some of the CIMMYT experimental hybrids to the best commercial hybrid checks that were included in those trials. And what we see here is that the big advantage of the CIMMYT materials is expressed in the lower yielding environments. Those below 4 or 5 tons per hectare is where CIMMYT hybrids actually exceeded the performance of most of the commercial checks quite significantly. And as we got into the higher yielding environments, they became very similar and in some cases not significantly better than the commercial checks. And this is exactly what CIMMYT's all about. We really aren't too worried about 9 and 10 ton per hectare regions. We really would like to be able to make a difference for farmers who are routinely achieving less than 2 tons per hectare. Okay, so now on to the third section, so that we can talk a little bit about nutrition itself. And I'm trying to get a quick check of how we're doing on time. Okay, seems like we're still fine. So we're still back to this cycle of nutrition and how that affects health, and then labor productivity, which we can also think of as poverty alleviation. This is a really cool plot. It tells a lot of the reality of what's happening in the world today. So let's take a quick look at this. We see on the x-axis the percent of household expenditure that on average a family spends on food. And hopefully you can find the United States on there. I'll give you a hint. It's way on the left, your left. So the U.S. on average, households spend less than 10% of their income on food. So what happens if prices go up 5%? Oh, well, you know, it's tough. You know, maybe you're going to spend 9 or 10% of your income on food instead of 7 or 8%, but most of us will manage. If you go to many of these countries, and all the red dots and circled or elliptically circled on the top right corner, these are mostly African countries. And you see many households in Africa spend 50, 60%, 40 to 60% of their household income on food. The y-axis tells you whether countries are net importers or exporters of food, cereals in particular. And so below the 0 point or the dashed line are countries that are net exporters. And the U.S. is one of us, one of the net exporters. But most of these African countries where households spend more than 40 or 50 or 60% of their income on food are net importers. So other factors come to play, such as exchange rates, such as international globalized markets, such as the U.S. spending more of their corn to produce biofuel, and therefore less of it's available for the export market to Mexico, which every year imports about 10 million tons of maize from the U.S. So these are all factors that come to bear upon the world situation that we live in and that affect these social unrest events that we've seen and that will certainly recur in future. So specifically looking at micronutrient malnutrition and how we can address this issue of nutrition, health, and wealth. In countries in particular, you see again Africa and India highlighted in red as countries where vitamin A deficiency among preschool children are highest. I've listed here some of the expressions and some of the issues that one suffers when one is vitamin A deficient. Of course, we all know about night blindness that can eventually lead to blindness, but what I was less familiar with when I started this work was how it's associated with so many other illnesses. Vitamin A deficiency compromises your immune system, which means that you're more susceptible to measles, diarrhea, malaria, mortality from other secondary concerns. So as you won't have forgotten, this relates very much as well to the wealth situation. What are the dietary sources of these micronutrients? Well, number one, meat, especially liver, some fish, oysters, and these are all in that category with the $4 signs. So you go back to that pyramid that I showed you near the beginning of my talk. These are the more expensive items available to consumers. And so when prices go up or when your income is being spent primarily on food, you tend to go for the cheaper items. You go for maize, you go for rice, you go for those items in the $1 sign that also those of us who were starving students at one time consume in abundant quantities. So biofortification, the project that I'm talking about for the next few minutes, is about enhancing the nutritional value of staple food crops. I've worked primarily on maize and provitamin A, but there are very good projects as well, even on cassava, as we heard from the previous speaker, but also working with sweet potatoes, working with rice, working with wheat. It's all about increasing the micronutrient concentration and the nutritional value of staple food crops, which are the foods that poorest consumers and those most likely to be suffering from micronutrient malnutrition and deficiency are able to afford, and the ones that they preferably consume, or they consume in preference. And yeah, I do like to highlight, of course, the preferred solution is that they get a nutritious and well-balanced diet. We're not saying that you should eat maize and maize should be the answer to all your needs. However, the reality being that poverty is still prevalent in many of these regions, biofortification of staple crops does have a role, at least in the medium term. It was also mentioned today, these don't have to be only higher in provitamin A or zinc or iron. They also have to be agronomically sufficient so that farmers will want to grow them. All these traits, drought tolerance, disease resistance, and yield, need to be included. I don't need to explain to you about breeding, so we go through a series of selection processes. But what I do want to spend a minute on is on some of the molecular markers that we've used and that we are using in this program. Early on in the project, several years ago, a couple of alleles were found for these two enzymes, lycopene epsilon cyclase and the CRID-RB1, or enzyme that catalyzes the step between beta-carotene and beta-cryptoxanthin. And we've actually been using marker-assisted selection to select for alleles that are less efficient enzymes for these two steps, and so that we can accumulate more beta-carotene, which is the preferred provitamin A carotenoid in maize. And so what we've done is we actually validated the effect of these two alleles in 26 maize populations. And if you're interested, you can look up this publication in 2013. But here's a summary of 6 populations that had all categories of the segregating generations or segregants from these crosses. And what we can see is that there are negative as well as positive effects from these types of selection. In general, if you look at the bottom half of this table and the right-hand column, by just selecting for the lycopene epsilon cyclase favorable allele, we do get increases in provitamin A from about 4.9 parts per million to 6, but they aren't huge. On the other hand, if we select for the CRID-RB1 or the hydroxylase gene, we can double, triple, and sometimes quadruple the amount of provitamin A. In this example, on average, it went from 3.6 to 8.4 parts per million by having the homozygous favorable CRID-RB1 allele. So tremendous positive impact in terms of increasing provitamin A, and largely by using this strategy, we've managed to develop materials that have more than 20 parts per million of provitamin A carotenoid in maize. And in case you don't know this, most yellow maize has about 2 parts per million, and often a little bit less than 2 parts per million. So we've managed to get it up to 20 parts per million. But over in yellow on the left-hand column, we see perhaps a negative effect of this, and zeaxanthin has actually decreased. We've sacrificed zeaxanthin to put more beta-carotene into our maize varieties. And of course, zeaxanthin also has favorable attributes in terms of macular protection. Somebody was asking me last night, whether we have automated seed chipping for DNA extraction, and we're actually in discussions with a major seed company to acquire access to some of this technology. But at the moment, we're using high-tech solution dog nail clippers to chip a small piece off of the kernel from which we can extract DNA, and we can make our selections before planting. So we save quite a lot of field costs by doing this, by selecting ahead of planting. Then we, of course, need agronomic trials. And here we can see that in 2012, we released the first, or not we, our partners, the National Program of Zambia, released the first 3 provitamin A enriched hybrids. These are now being commercially sold by 3 seed companies in Zambia. And there have been subsequent releases of provitamin A biofortified varieties in these countries you see listed. This one in Malawi, I just found out 2 days ago that there were 4 hybrids released in Malawi, one of which is from the first 3 that were released in Zambia. Now, one of the things that impresses me about Texas A&M is your program on food technology. And so we've done a little bit of work on food technology and what happens to those carotenoids. This morning, Irwin talked about what happens to some of the favorable nutrients in onions when you boil them. Well, we also have problems with losses of carotenoids when foods are prepared. And so we found that in making this porridge, which is the main form in which maize is consumed in most of Eastern and Southern Africa, on average, Shanshan Lee at Iowa State found about 25% loss of beta-carotene. For those of us that prefer Fritos, there's still a considerable loss. About 36% of the provitamin A is lost in preparing fried snacks from nixtamalized maize, and here you can see some tamales with about 40% loss. So this is a tremendously important contribution to our knowledge about what happens. And also just in storage, as maize is stored either in flour, it's worse, but even in grain, you have some degradation of carotenoids over time. And one of the exciting new markers that we're looking for would be markers that would actually influence the cleavage enzymes that actually result in the breakdown of carotenoids. So there's an opportunity still. I mean, we might get there before you guys do, but we're working on finding markers for alleles that reduce the activity of some of the carotenoid cleavage enzymes so that we don't lose as much during storage. Now, the really interesting question, does it work? Is it efficacious? And we didn't really have an answer until about 2 years ago when we conducted trials in Zambia in 3 different communities working with children, feeding them diets of biofortified provitamin A maize or white maize with a vitamin A supplement. So here's some cool pictures. Of course, before they can eat, they all had to wash their hands. So that was one of the experiences. And here they are eating their diets. And these are all weighed out portions of whichever treatment they were assigned. They all had their numbered bowls so that you knew exactly who was eating and how much they were eating and how much they were not eating, because at the end, after they ate, the same lady who served them actually weighed how much they left behind so that consumption could be measured. And here's some of the results. And published in 2014 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, the short title of the paper, Orange Maize is as efficacious as a vitamin A supplement. So that kind of tells the story, but let me show you a few of the results and what we did or what was done in this table. There was first a period of baseline assessment to see how the kids were all doing. Then they were assigned to 3 treatments, one of 3 treatments. Either they were eating white maize without any supplement of vitamin A, they were eating orange maize with no supplemented vitamin A, or they were eating white maize with vitamin A supplementation. So they did this diet for 90 days, and then they had a 7-day washout to allow equilibration, and then a blood test was done to see what their vitamin A reserves were at the end of the period. So here you can see results. The baselines for both traits, and this is total body reserves of retinol as well as liver retinol content. And you can see that there were no significant differences at the beginning in the baseline. And at the end line, you can see that the two treatments, the orange and the white maize plus vitamin A, were both similar and were both superior to the white maize without vitamin A. Also, the two treatments, orange and white maize plus vitamin A, were not significantly different from each other, indicating that indeed, as the short title suggests, orange maize was shown to be as efficacious as vitamin A supplementation in maintaining total body reserves for retinol. So the next question we're always asked is, well, is anybody going to eat this stuff? Because if you've been to this region, you'll see that everybody eats white maize. It's pretty much a given that maize that you're going to consume is going to be white, whereas if it's going to have carotenoids, it's going to be orange or yellow. And so the question is, will they eat orange maize? And there's a little bit of a precedent because a sister project within this Harvest Plus initiative is working with sweet potatoes, and you see a picture of sweet potatoes. I think you're going to hear about sorghum this afternoon as well. In the sweet potato case, in Africa, most of the sweet potatoes are white. And so now we're showing them orange sweet potatoes. And there's been quite an effort to increase the awareness of the importance of orange sweet potatoes, and a lot has been learned from the efforts on orange sweet potatoes, primarily in Mozambique and Uganda, and a lot of that is being applied by colleagues in Zambia to promote and to create demand for orange maize. And so here are some of the examples of what's going on. This was in either Uganda or Mozambique. The pictures are a little bit mixed, but they're common themes. I think one of the most important ones is teaching mothers about the importance of micronutrients. And that goes back to that first slide that I was talking about. You know, when there are 3 generations that it can be required to overcome severe malnutrition in humans. And the most efficient way, or one of the most efficient ways to improve on this, is to train women. And why women? It's because in most households, women are those who are preparing the food. And women are, of course, men as well, very concerned about the health and well-being of their children. And so if women truly understand the value of a healthy and nutritious diet, they're going to be much more likely to look for orange sweet potato instead of white and when they're going to prepare the food for their family. So a big effort is nutrition education. And so hopefully some of you will choose to work in nutrition education. Raising awareness, and here's just a few cool pictures of what's being done around sub-Saharan Africa to raise awareness about the importance. And you see this cool cartoon where you're protected, your immune system is protecting you from the attack from bacteria and other nasties. And then you have the better football player. I'm not sure if it can do that for you, but it looks like you're going to be a better athlete if you consume a nutritious diet, and you'll be able to see better at night. The example of the man speaking into the microphone. They have a lot of drama. So they have traveling drama teams that give popular stories about the importance of nutrition, about the importance of micronutrients. And of course, a form of entertainment is always welcome, particularly under poor conditions where you probably don't have television or other sources of entertainment. And then just a lot of orange everywhere. And so in Zambia, you see the orange trucks driving around, and you wonder what it is, or you know what it is. So it's part of the advertising about how orange foods are delicious and nutritious. Very important when you're involved in these interventions, and remember, we're looking for interventions that can have an impact on this triangle between nutrition, health, and poverty. So when you start to have these interventions, it's very important to make sure that there's a market. And so market development, hugely important. The last thing you want to do is get a whole bunch of enthusiastic farmers to grow orange sweet potatoes or orange maize and then not be able to sell it, and then come back to you and complain that they've actually lost their shirt. So we've asked, in Zambia, what would it take for Zambian consumers to accept and to grow and consume orange maize? And some of the more interesting responses we've received is, one of them, and this is a good lesson for all of you future plant breeders, the technology has to be labor neutral or reducing. And you see this woman, she's making the nshima. You stir a pot of thick porridge. It's hard work. She's got a pretty big baby on her back, and she doesn't want it to be any more work than it already is, even better if it's less work. Now, Mark Mbunji, he was formerly head of Seedco, one of the largest companies, and the one who's marketing one of these provitamin A varieties in Zambia. He basically said, you know what, farmers don't really care about micronutrients. They want better yield. And so we're focused on yield and forget about those micro things. So, okay, we can think about micro, but we can't forget about yield. And then the real line, the Zambia Consumers Association, Mr. Lilonga says, consumers are very sensitive about cost. And after Irwin's presentation, I'm sorry I had a picture here of an angry Indian man with his onions because of the prices of onions having gone up, but I thought I didn't have time to explain it, so I took that out of my presentation yesterday. Here's some results. Where are we today? This is as of 2015, and these are quotes that I obtained from Eliab Simpungwe, who's the leader of Harvest Plus in Zambia. And he told me that by the end of last year, one of the orange maize hybrids, I'm sure it's the one that Seedco, the largest of the companies, is commercializing, had gained about 1% of the market. And, that's pretty good, for something that's brand new and that's so different from what they're used to growing. I was pretty impressed. Okay, it's already 100,000 farmers who are growing provitamin A maize in Zambia. There's 4 maize milling companies who are interested in buying orange maize. They're being introduced into retail shops. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. The number of farmers is projected to grow over the next over half a million in the next 4 years. And here's a good lesson for all of you who are planning interventions. The tribal leader, or the chief, as they call them, in the eastern province, became the first adopter. Now, in these communities, people watch what the tribal leaders, what the influencers in their communities are doing. We all look at who the influencers here. Well, when I was at this age, it was Michael Jordan. If Michael Jordan was eating cornflakes, I thought, well, maybe I should eat cornflakes too. Well, here it's what does the tribal leader do? What do the successful farmers do? And so this has had a tremendous impact on Eastern Province being the lead producer of biofortified maize in Zambia. Here you see it on the shelves. Some of those bags, the ones that look like the ones in the blow-up, are there. And this was Wolfgang Pfeiffer being asked by the security guard why we were taking pictures in the grocery store. But we did get out alive, as you can see. So kind of as a summary slide, this picture shows all the types of disciplines that have been involved in this project. Everything from breeding through molecular biology. I took out slides on plant biochemistry and development of methodologies, agronomy, food technology, a lot of nutritional science that I learned about during my work on this project, socioeconomics, farmer participatory research, nutrition education, leading to healthier children. So yesterday, one of the students here at Texas A&M asked me, what's your advice? What would you tell us that we should do? And my words of perhaps wisdom were, you just pick the profession that you love. Because if you're not doing something that you love to do, it's going to be really hard to stick with it and to do it well. So pick what you love and then figure out how it plugs in to making a difference. And you can make a difference in almost any profession, as this slide hopefully illustrates. And so I don't have a red card yet. I'm going to show my last slide, coming back to Norman Borlaug. Again, a challenge to the students in the room. And this is from his acceptance speech when he was given the Nobel Prize. And he read this speech in his acceptance. And he was asking, where are the leaders who have the necessary scientific competence, the vision, the common sense, the social consciousness, and the qualities of leadership? And last night over dinner, I was thinking, here they are. I thought I had a pretty interesting discussion last night with 4 of the speakers who you're going to hear from in the student sessions. And I thought, the world is in pretty good hands. But nonetheless, you have to have the persistent determination to convert potential benefits. These potential benefits of provitamin A or of nutritious onions or carrots got to convert these into reality and real benefits for humankind. There's not enough of you guys, and we must develop them in Texas A&M, in Wisconsin, and Georgia, and all of our universities. So you guys are the good news. And if you haven't watched this video, I assume you all have, but see that on the bottom line is the link to Norman Borlaug rapping. You got to see that because it's really great. And he says basically what he said here in the quote, you got to play your card. So your scientific knowledge, if you know that something's going to work, you've got to be persistent and make it work towards that intervention path that you see up on the, what is that for you? Your left upper corner. So with that, I'll thank you for once again for inviting me, and hopefully there'll be some questions and even some emails coming into me.
Thank you, Dr. Pixley, for your presentation. We have time for a few questions. You can raise your hand. We'll send the mic over to you. And those attending us via webinar, submit your question on the webinar question text box. Do we have any questions on the floor? We have one question on the left.
Where?
Wait, can you hold on till we bring the microphone? Thank you.
My time's up.
So very nice and informative presentation, Dr. Pixley. I would like to ask, does the world see food scarcity as a problem right now? I mean, even if you put more specifically, does the market see food scarcity as a problem? Because logically thinking, you would expect agricultural commodities price to go a little higher every year, but it keeps going down. So can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think right at the moment we're in a period of some complacency because we've had a couple of good years. A lot of the prices are down. Oil prices are down at the moment. But I think historically we can be sure that food prices will go up again. And we know, as Megan Clark said from CSIRO, that the demand for food is going to go up tremendously with 9.5 billion people on the planet by 2050. And as people get wealthier, they want a better diet. They want more meat. They want products that require more grain to produce, meat and dairy in particular. So perhaps scarcity isn't the right word. There are other ways to go about it. And I would say one of them is reducing waste. And we waste about 40% of the food that's produced globally. That's still not going to solve the problem, but it will help us a lot. And I think technologies in terms of agricultural production will help us to produce enough food. But if we're, climate change is actually taking us backwards in terms of production. The higher temperatures are taking us backwards, and the depletion of water for agriculture is taking us backwards. So the last thing I would want you to be is complacent, but there's also no need to panic. I think, each one of us has to decide, are we going to be optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And I think if you're optimistic, you're going to roll up your sleeves and get to work and develop better varieties that can sustainably produce, because we're worried about future generations as much as today's. But is there enough food? There probably is right now. Will there be? That depends on what you guys do with this planet in the next few decades.
Thank you. Do we have another question on the floor? I have a question. So there was a recent science article showing that the population is expected to grow in 2050. In most of the developing countries, it will level off, except for the continent of Africa. It should keep increasing. You said you wanted to increase yield to 2%. What are some of the goals to meet those yield demands for an increasing population in the continent of Africa?
Well, Africa is projected to have has the fastest growing population rates and will continue to have the fastest growing populations. And probably one of the greatest misperceptions is that if you actually increase food production and increase wealth or decrease poverty, that you'll actually have more mouths to feed because you're saving lives, right? But it's actually the opposite effect. As populations become wealthier, they begin to have fewer children. And this is what we're seeing happening in the United States, what we're seeing happening in Europe and Japan, where in many countries actually fertility rates are below replacement rates. And so in Africa, the answer, again, is poverty alleviation and better nutrition for better health. So in the short term, absolutely, they need more food production. Fortunately, Africa is one of the last places in the world where there's still opportunity to increase agricultural land area for production. And there's tremendous opportunities if we think about reducing yield gap. which is basically the difference between potential yield and the actually achieved yields, that 1.3 tons per hectare in Zambia. I'm sure those farmers can get 4 or 5, if not 6 or 7 tons per hectare, if they have the technologies and access to those technologies. And so reducing yield gaps is one, improving conditions in all conditions of life, education, nutrition, health, so that they can actually have more wealth, will reduce the population growth rates. So it's all intertwined. And one of the interesting things that I like to try to get across is that it's all related. And so each one of us has to do our piece of the puzzle in order to contribute to the ultimate solution. But that's a long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully it gives you a little bit to think about.
Thank you. Any other questions in the floor or via webinar? All right. Thank you, Dr. Pixley. Oh, we had one more. Sorry.
Kevin, I was wondering, could you comment or describe a little bit the depth to which CIMMYT is using sequencing technologies beyond just like marker-assisted selection in terms of probing the basis for genetic variation of some of the important traits? And the second part to that is, are you seeing any evidence for copy number variation as being a factor in this? It's gotten to be a pretty big thing, for instance, in the medical world.
At CIMMYT, we're very much involved in genomic selection in our breeding program, so that's one way that we're using genetic information. The actual sequencing information that I was describing as part of the Seeds of Discovery has actually led us to identify sources of resistance for tar spot disease complex, which is a problem in Central America and in southern Mexico, simply by finding accessions that had variation in the regions that our best sources had as well. We're using it to identify diversity that's different from what's in our elite lines. So we've, of course, sequenced all of our CIMMYT maize lines, or CMLs, and we can tell whether the diversity that's associated with a favorable trait is already captured in our CMLs or not. And so we're using it to make that kind of selection of germplasm. Now, specifically about copy number, I really don't know if we have any examples where we've seen copy number to be important, but most likely in wheat, particularly where you have synteny among the 3 different genomes that come into bred wheat, you would expect to see copy number differences that would be important for disease resistance, for example. But to my knowledge, we haven't examined that closely.
All right. Let's thank Dr. Pixley again for his presentation.